What is the true value of a single moment? For Albert Langdon, a man who could buy anything. It was a question he'd forgotten how to answer. He lived in a fortress of wealth, but his heart was imprisoned by grief and the silent suffering of his son Jay. He thought money was the only tool he had left. But in the sticky, chaotic clatter of a run-down diner under the harsh fluorescent lights, a struggling waitress with tired eyes and worn-out shoes would show him a power that no fortune could ever purchase. She would perform one simple, instinctive act of kindness for his son, an act that would unravel a web of deceit and change the course of 3 lives forever. Albert Langdon's world was one of bespoke suits, sanitized boardrooms, and the quiet hum of a stock ticker that sang a constant lullaby of success. His penthouse on the 80th floor of the Langdon Tower in downtown Chicago offered a god's-eye view of the city, a sprawling map of assets and opportunities. From up there, people were ants, their struggles insignificant, their lives a distant abstraction. It was a perspective he had cultivated, a necessary detachment for a man whose decisions could make or break fortunes. But this detachment had become a disease. It had seeped from his business life into his personal one, leaving him in a gilded cage of his own making. The cage had been locked from the inside the day he lost his wife, Eleanor. She had been the color in his black and white world, the one who understood that the true assets of their life were not listed on any exchange. Their son, Jay, born just 2 years before the accident, was their shared masterpiece. But Jay was born different. Cerebral palsy had mapped out a different path for him, one of spastic, uncontrolled movements of a mind sharp and bright, trapped in a body that wouldn't obey. After Eleanor's death, Albert's world collapsed into 2 distinct zones: the relentless logical pursuit of more wealth and the helpless emotional vortex of caring for Jay. He hired the best of everything, the most renowned pediatric neurologists, the most sought-after physical therapists, a team of round-the-clock nurses. Jay's wing of the penthouse was a state-of-the-art medical facility, disguised with soft lighting and cartoon murals. Yet for all the money poured into it, it was a place of profound silence. Jay, now 8 years old, was non-verbal. He communicated through a sophisticated eye-gaze computer, but more often than not, frustration would win, and the silence would be shattered by guttural cries of rage and despair. These episodes were becoming more frequent. The team of professionals, for all their qualifications, treated Jay with a clinical distance. They saw him as a patient, a set of symptoms to be managed. They did their jobs efficiently, but they did not see the boy inside. They didn't see the flicker of humor in his eyes when a cartoon character fell down, or the way his breathing would soften when he heard his mother's favorite classical piece. Albert saw it, and it was killing him. One Tuesday afternoon, Dr. Peterson, a man with a kind face and a somber tone, sat opposite Albert in his sprawling office. The meltdowns are a manifestation of his inability to control his environment, Albert. He's lashing out. He needs something more. A new stimulus, a break from the routine. Have you ever thought of just taking him to a park, a diner, somewhere normal? Normal. The word was alien. For Jay, normal was a sterile environment, predictable and safe. The outside world was a chaotic minefield of sensory overload. A diner, Albert repeated the word tasting strange. With the noise, the people. He can't handle that. Perhaps Dr. Peterson said, adjusting his glasses. Or perhaps we've been underestimating him. Perhaps what he needs is not less stimulation, but the right kind. The world is messy, Albert. Maybe he needs to feel a small part of it with you there, to make him feel safe. The idea terrified Albert. It wasn't the logistics. He had a team for that. It was the exposure. The thought of his son, his beautiful, fragile son, having a meltdown in public of the stares, the whispers, the judgment. It was a nightmare. But the image of Jay's face red and contorted in a silent scream, just that morning as a worse one. He had to try. The diner was called the Greasy Spoon. It was everything Albert's life was not. Located in a working-class neighborhood miles from his downtown spire. The air was thick with the smell of fried onions and old coffee. The vinyl on the booth seats was cracked, and the clatter of plates and loud conversations was a deafening roar compared to the monastic quiet of his home. Albert dressed down in a simple polo shirt and slacks, an outfit his head of security, Richard, had to procure for him, felt as conspicuous as if he'd worn a crown. Richard sat in a separate booth near the door, a silent, watchful guardian. A specially trained male nurse, Robert sat with Albert tasked with managing Jay's feeding. Jay was in a customized wheelchair, a tray fitted across the front. He looked around, his dark eyes wide, taking in the chaos. For a few minutes, he seemed fascinated. He watched a cook flip pancakes on the griddle, a small, almost smile gracing his lips. Albert felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the doctor was right. The hope was short-lived. A waitress dropped a tray of dishes. The resulting crash was like a gunshot in the small space. Jay's body went rigid. His head snapped back, and a low moan escaped his lips. His arms, which had been resting on his tray, began to jerk spastically. The moan grew louder, escalating into a high-pitched cry of distress. The diner's cheerful cacophony died down. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Albert saw the looks he had dreaded: annoyance, pity, and outright disgust. "Can't you shut that kid up?" a man from a nearby table grumbled. Albert's face burned with a mixture of shame and fury. Robert the nurse went into clinical mode. "It's okay, Jay. Deep breaths. Let's use your tools." He tried to guide Jay's hand to a stress ball, but Jay thrashed, knocking it to the floor. The crying intensified. Albert felt the walls closing in. He wanted to scream at them all, to tell them this was his son, that he was beautiful and perfect, but the words were trapped in his throat. He just wanted to disappear. He motioned to Robert, a silent command. "Get him out of here. Now." As Robert began to unlatch the wheelchair, a voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, sir." Albert looked up. A waitress stood by their table. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her cheap polyester uniform was faded. Her name tag, pinned crookedly, read, "Grace." "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. She wasn't looking at Albert. Her eyes were on Jay. "We're leaving." "Albert," said his tone, clipped and cold. Grace ignored him. She knelt down, bringing herself to Jay's eye level. The crying was now a series of desperate, shuddering gasps. "Hey there, handsome," she said, her voice a low murmur. "That was a really loud noise, wasn't it? That scared me too." Jay's thrashing paused for a fraction of a second. His wide, tear-filled eyes locked on her. "It's okay to be scared." Grace continued her gaze, never leaving his. "But you're safe. See all these people. They're just having lunch. And that loud noise is all gone now." She glanced at Albert. "Does he like to be held?" The question caught him off guard. The nurses rarely held Jay unless it was for a transfer. It wasn't part of the care plan. Albert himself. When was the last time he had truly held his son? Not just to move him, but to comfort him. The memory was painfully distant. Sometimes Albert managed to say, "But it's difficult. May I?" Grace asked her eyes, asking for genuine permission, not just professional clearance. Albert hesitated for a moment, then gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. Grace moved with a practiced ease that belied her apparent lack of formal training. She spoke to Jay the entire time. "Okay, buddy, I'm just going to lift you up. We're going to go on a little adventure, just you and me." She carefully slid her arms under Jay's back and beneath his knees, mindful of his stiff limbs. She lifted him from the chair, and instead of holding him at arm's length, she pulled him close, his head resting in the crook of her neck, his body flush against hers. She was surprisingly strong. She began to sway gently, humming a simple, tuneless melody. It wasn't a song, just a sound, a low, soothing vibration. And then the miracle happened. Jay's stiff body began to relax. The shuddering gasps subsided, replaced by deep, ragged breaths. His hands, which had been balled into tight fists, slowly uncurled. He let out a long, soft sigh and burrowed his face deeper into Grace's shoulder. The diner, the people, the noise, it all melted away. In that moment, there was only the waitress and the boy, swaying gently in a small bubble of peace. Albert stared, his heart pounding in his chest. The nurses with their degrees, the doctors with their theories, the therapists with their charts, none of them had ever done this. None of them had been able to reach his son in the middle of a storm and lead him back to shore. Grace stood there for a full minute, humming and swaying, her eyes closed. When she opened them, she looked at Albert. A small, tired smile touched her lips. "He's okay," she whispered. He was just overwhelmed. She carefully placed the now calm boy back into his wheelchair. Jay looked up at her, and for the first time that day, he wasn't looking through someone. He was seeing her. He lifted a shaky hand and with immense effort brushed his fingers against her cheek. Grace's smile widened. She gently held his hand for a moment before placing it back on his tray. "You take it easy, sweet boy," she said softly. She stood up, her face instantly shifting back to a professional waitress mask. "Can I get you folks anything else, or just the check?" Albert couldn't speak. He was poleaxed. He reached into his wallet, pulled out all the cash, he had several $100 bills, and dropped them on the table. He stood up, nodded curtly to Robert to push the chair, and walked out of the diner without a word, his security man Richard falling in step behind him. As the tinted windows of his Rolls-Royce slid up, sealing him back in his silent, sterile world, Albert watched Grace through the glass. She was clearing the table, her face a mask of weary efficiency. She hadn't even looked at the money yet. But Albert Langdon wasn't looking at the money either. He was looking at the woman who had, in the space of 3 minutes, shown him just how poor he truly was. "Richard," he said, his voice raspy with an emotion he couldn't name. "Sir, find out everything there is to know about that woman. Her name is Grace. I want to know where she lives, who she is, what she needs. Everything." "Of course," Sir Richard replied, already discreetly typing into his phone. Albert leaned his head back against the cool leather. For the first time in years, the hum of the stock ticker in his mind had been replaced by a different sound, the faint, tuneless hum of a waitress in a cheap diner. And he knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that he couldn't let that sound fade away. Grace O'Malley counted her tips that night under the flickering bulb of her cramped studio apartment. The total was abysmal. After paying for her bus pass and a small bag of groceries, she'd have just enough to cover the late fee on her mother's nursing home bill. The extra cash from that strange, silent man in the polo shirt helped, but she felt a pang of guilt about it. He'd left nearly $500, a sum so large it felt more like a mistake than a tip. The man had looked so haunted, and his son. Thinking of the boy, Jay brought a dull ache to her chest. She'd seen that kind of terror in a child's eyes before, and she recognized the helplessness in the father's. She pushed the thoughts away. She had her own problems. A mountain of student debt from a community college nursing program she'd had to abandon when her mother's Alzheimer's worsened. 2 jobs, the diner during the day, and cleaning offices 3 nights a week that barely kept her head above water. Sleep was a luxury, and dreams were a currency she couldn't afford. 2 days later, as she was leaving the diner after a grueling 8-hour shift, a sleek black car, the kind she'd only ever seen in movies, pulled up to the curb beside her. The back window glided down, revealing a man in a sharp suit with a severe expression. "Grace O'Malley?" he asked. His voice was polite, but held an unmistakable air of authority. Grace's first thought was that she was in trouble. "Debt collectors." "Who's asking?" she said, clutching her worn backpack strap. "My name is Richard Lowell. I am the head of personal staff for Mr. Albert Langdon. You served him and his son 2 days ago." Langdon. The name clicked. Langdon Tower. The billionaire. The silent man in the polo shirt wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country. The $500 tip suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. "Mr. Langdon would like to speak with you, Richard," said his tone, leaving no room for refusal. "He has a proposition for you. Will you come with me?" Every instinct screamed at Grace to run. This is how horror movies started. But then she thought of the eviction notice tucked under a magnet on her fridge, of the worried look on her mother's doctor's face. What did she have to lose that wasn't already slipping through her fingers? "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The interior of the Rolls-Royce was like stepping into another dimension. It was silent, a world away from the screeching brakes and blaring horns of the street. It smelled faintly of leather and something else. Money. It was a 20-minute drive to the Langdon Tower, a drive Grace spent in a state of suspended disbelief. The private elevator ascended with stomach-lurching speed, opening directly into the penthouse. The view was staggering, the entire city glittering below them like a carpet of diamonds. The apartment was vast, minimalist, and cold. It felt more like a modern art museum than a home. And standing there, framed by a floor-to-ceiling window, was Albert Langdon. In a tailored suit, he was no longer just a haunted man in a diner. He was an intimidating force of nature. "Ms. O'Malley." "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice formal. Jay was there too, in his wheelchair next to a woman in a crisp, starched uniform. The woman eyed Grace with open disdain. Jay's eyes, however, lit up with recognition. He made a small, happy sound and rocked slightly in his chair. Albert's severe expression softened almost imperceptibly as he glanced at his son. "As you can see," he said, turning back to Grace, "my son remembers you." "Hello, Jay." Grace said, a natural smile breaking through her nervousness. She knelt down to his level just as she had in the diner. "It's good to see you again." Jay's hand twitched, and he vocalized again, a clear sound of pleasure. "I'll be direct. Ms. O'Malley." Albert began stepping away from the window. I have spent millions on the best care for my son. I have a team of specialists. Yet in 2 minutes you accomplished something they have failed to do for years. You brought him peace during a moment of extreme distress. He gestured around the opulent room. I can provide him with everything except for what he truly needs. That connection. You have it. Grace stood up, feeling her cheeks flush. I don't know what I did. That's just it, Albert interrupted. You didn't do anything from a textbook. It was instinctive. Human. I want to hire you, Ms. O'Malley, not as a nurse or a therapist. I want to hire you to be a companion for Jay. He named a salary. It was a number so large, Grace thought she had misheard him. It was more than she made in 10 years. Her mind reeled. She could pay off her debts. She could move her mother to the best care facility in the state. She could finally breathe. But the offer felt too good to be true. There had to be a catch. Mr. Langdon, I'm not qualified. I'm a waitress. I dropped out of nursing school. Your qualifications are irrelevant to me. Your results are not. I watched you with him. There was no fear, no clinical detachment. There was empathy. Just then another woman entered the room. She was impeccably dressed, her face a mask of sculpted condescension. She looked to be in her late 50s with sharp features and even sharper eyes. Albert, darling, Richard told me you brought the waitress here, she said, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness. She shot a dismissive look at Grace. Surely you aren't serious about this. Albert's jaw tightened. Brenda, this is Miss O'Malley. Ms. O'Malley. This is Brenda Caldwell, my late wife's sister. A pleasure, Brenda said, though her expression said the exact opposite. She turned back to Albert, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, but one Grace could easily overhear. Albert, for heaven's sake, she's a nobody from a greasy spoon. You know nothing about her. She could be a grifter, a fortune hunter. You can't entrust Jay to a complete stranger, especially one from her background. The insult stung, but Grace kept her expression neutral. She was used to being looked down upon. That will be enough, Brenda Albert said, his voice dangerously low. This is my decision. Brenda gave a theatrical sigh. I am only thinking of Jay as his aunt and godmother. Eleanor would have wanted him surrounded by professionals, not charity cases. She gave Grace one last withering look before turning to Jay. Come, my sweet boy. Let's get you away from all this unpleasantness. She started to push his wheelchair, but Jay resisted, letting out a small whine and looking back toward Grace. The small act of defiance seemed to cement Albert's decision. The offer stands, Miss O'Malley. You will have a contract drawn up by my lawyers. You will be given a suite of rooms here in the tower. All your expenses will be covered. Your only job will be to spend time with Jay. Talk to him. Read to him. Be with him. Do whatever it is you did in that diner. Grace's mind was a whirlwind. This was a lifeline, a fantasy she'd never dared to have. But Brenda Caldwell's presence was a blaring alarm bell. She was walking into a snake pit. Still, the image of her mother's faded smile in that drab, underfunded nursing home flashed in her mind. For her, she could endure anything. There's one condition, Grace said, finding a sliver of courage. Albert raised an eyebrow. Name it. I need to be able to see my mother. She's in a home in Elmwood Park. I go every Sunday. Albert nodded. That will be arranged. You will have a car and driver at your disposal. It was done. In the space of an hour, Grace O'Malley had gone from a waitress worried about a late fee to the highly paid companion of a billionaire's son. As she signed the contract later that week, the lawyer's pen feeling heavy and foreign in her hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was signing away more than just her time. She felt Brenda Caldwell's shadow looming over the whole arrangement, and she knew that this gilded cage, for all its comforts, would come with its own set of dangers. Her life had been changed, but the story was far from over. It was just beginning. The first few weeks were a disorienting blend of surreal luxury and painstaking work. Grace's new home was a 3-room suite with a view that made her feel dizzy every time she looked out the window. The clothes in her closet had been replaced by a wardrobe curated by a personal shopper. The food prepared by a private chef was art on a plate. But these things were just background noise. Her entire world shrunk to the size of one small boy. Her approach was simple. She treated Jay not as a patient, but as a person. She learned the intricate language of his eye-gaze computer, but she also learned the language of his souls, his grunts, and the subtle shifts in his muscle tension. She discovered he loved the smell of rain, the feel of velvet, and the sound of David Bowie. She read him not just children's books, but chapters from The Hobbit, acting out all the parts with dramatic voices that made him chuckle a dry, breathy sound that was the most beautiful music she'd ever heard. She took him to the penthouse's private indoor garden, a lush, humid sanctuary, and let him touch the soft moss and fragrant blossoms. She put headphones on him and played him music, watching his body sway in his chair to the rhythm. For the first time, Jay's world was expanding beyond therapy mats and medical charts. Albert watched all of this from a distance, a silent, brooding observer. He saw the changes in his son. The meltdowns lessened, replaced by a new quiet alertness. Jay was using his communication device, more typing out single words. More. Funny. Grace, happy. Each word was a sledgehammer to the wall around Albert's heart. He found himself having conversations with Grace, stilted at first, then more natural. He'd ask about Jay's day, and she would recount it with a vibrant enthusiasm that was infectious. She didn't just report on his status, she told him stories. He absolutely loves the part where Bilbo tricks the trolls, she'd say, her eyes shining. I think he sees a bit of himself in Bilbo, small and underestimated, but cleverer than anyone knows. Albert started joining them for short periods, then longer ones. He sat on the floor with Grace as she read, feeling the awkwardness of a foreigner in his own home. He was learning to be a father again, not just a provider. But for every step forward, Brenda Caldwell was there trying to push them 2 steps back. Brenda was a constant toxic presence. She would appear unannounced, her stilettos clicking on the marble floors like a warning. She treated Grace with a corrosive mix of condescension and suspicion. "Still here, are we?" she'd say to Grace, her smile a slash of red lipstick. "Enjoying the view. I do hope you're not getting too comfortable." She would constantly try to undermine Grace in front of Albert. "I noticed you were reading him that fantasy nonsense, Ms. O'Malley. Don't you think something more educational would be appropriate? Perhaps a documentary on economics. It's never too early to learn the family business." He was laughing, Albert would reply flatly, cutting the conversation short. Brenda's attacks grew more insidious. She began planting seeds of doubt. "I saw her on her phone earlier, Albert." Smiling. "Who is she texting? Does she have a boyfriend? You must have Richard run a more thorough background check. People like her can be duplicitous." One afternoon, Grace was helping Jay with his physical therapy, a series of gentle stretches. Brenda swept in a horrified look on her face. "What are you doing to him?" she gasped. "You're not a physical therapist. You could hurt him." "This is precisely what I warned you about, Albert. She's a liability." Grace calmly explained that she was only doing the exercises shown to her by Dr. Peterson's team. But Brenda had already planted the seed. Later, Albert quietly asked Richard to confirm Grace's story with the therapy team, which he did. Albert was relieved, but Grace felt the sting of his doubt. The trust between them was still fragile. The real twist of the knife came a month later. Albert's late wife, Eleanor, had a collection of exquisite jewelry. He kept it in a safe in his study, a sacred vault of memories. One of her most cherished pieces was a sapphire and diamond necklace, a gift for their first anniversary. Brenda came to Albert one evening, her face a mask of feigned distress. "Albert, I don't want to alarm you, but I was looking for a photo of Eleanor earlier, and I went into the study. The safe was slightly ajar." Albert's blood ran cold. Richard and Brenda went to the study. The massive steel door was indeed not fully latched. Inside, everything seemed to be in its place until Brenda let out a small, theatrical cry. "Oh no. Albert, Eleanor's necklace. The sapphire one. It's gone." Panic seized Albert. He searched frantically, but it was nowhere. The necklace wasn't just valuable. It was irreplaceable. It was Eleanor. "There's only one explanation," Brenda said, her voice low and grave. "It's her. The waitress. Who else could it be? She's been here for weeks, watching, waiting. This has been her plan all along. To win your trust and then rob you blind." "That's a serious accusation," Brenda Albert said. But the seed of doubt she had been watering for weeks had begun to sprout. He remembered her warnings. She could be a grifter. He thought of Grace's impoverished background. The temptation must have been enormous. Think about it, Albert. She has access to the entire penthouse. She saw you open that safe last week to get out Eleanor's watch. She's clever. She plays the part of the devoted caregiver, but it's all an act. Albert's mind was in turmoil. His instinct, the cold, cynical voice that had guided him in business for decades, screamed that Brenda was right. It was the most logical explanation. But then the image of Grace holding Jay, in the diner of her patient smile as she read to him, fought back. The two realities could not coexist. He needed proof. "Richard," he commanded, his voice tight. "Search Miss O'Malley's rooms, now." Richard looked uncomfortable. "Sir, are you sure?" "Do it," Albert barked. Grace was with Jay in the garden when Richard and 2 other security guards entered her suite. She was alerted by the head housekeeper, Maria, a kind older woman who had taken a liking to her. Grace rushed back to her rooms to find them being systematically turned upside down. "What's going on?" she asked, her heart pounding. Richard wouldn't meet her eye. "Mr. Langdon's orders, Miss O'Malley." They searched her drawers, her closet under her mattress. And then in the side pocket of the worn backpack, she'd first arrived with a bag she barely used anymore. One of the guards pulled out the glittering sapphire necklace. It lay on the bed, sparkling under the lights, a symbol of everything she was being accused of. Grace stared at it, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. I've never seen that before in my life," she stammered. "I don't know how that got there." But her words sounded weak, pathetic, exactly what a guilty person would say. Moments later, she was standing in the living room in front of Albert. Brenda stood beside him, a look of vindicated triumph on her face. Jay was parked nearby, his eyes wide with confusion and fear, sensing the tension. "So this is who you are," Albert said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He held up the necklace. All of it. The kindness, the caring. It was all a lie. A long con to get to this. "No," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I swear to you I didn't take it. I would never. Please, you have to believe me." "Believe you?" Albert scoffed, the sound bitter. "I wanted to. I truly did. You made me believe in something other than suspicion and cynicism. You were my one lapse in judgment. And this is the price, Albert." "She's a common thief," Brenda interjected smoothly. "You should call the police. Have her arrested." "No," Grace cried, her eyes pleading with Albert. "Mr. Langdon, Albert, look at Jay. You know what we have is real. You know it." Jay, agitated by the scene, began to whine, his body tensing. He started typing frantically on his communication device. "Grace. No. Grace. Home." Albert glanced at his son, his resolve faltering for a second. The pain in Jay's eyes was undeniable, but the evidence in his hand felt just as real. The betrayal was a physical pain, sharp and deep. "Pack your things," Albert said, his voice like stone. "Richard will escort you out. You have 1 hour. Be grateful I'm not calling the authorities. Now get out of my sight." He turned his back on her, a final, brutal dismissal. Grace stood frozen, the world collapsing around her. She had been so close to escaping her old life, so close to a future she'd never imagined. Now it was all gone, destroyed by a lie. As she walked toward her rooms on numb legs, past the triumphant smirk of Brenda Caldwell, she caught Jay's gaze. His eyes were filled with tears, and in them she saw the same helpless terror he'd had in the diner. But this time she was the one they were taking away. This time there was no one to hold him and tell him it would be okay. The hour Grace was given felt like both an eternity and an instant. She moved in a daze, throwing her few original belongings back into the worn backpack. The designer clothes, the expensive toiletries, they were part of a life that no longer belonged to her. A dream from which she'd had the rudest awakening. The kind housekeeper, Maria, came in and silently helped her fold a few items, her face etched with sympathy. "I do not believe it, Mija," Maria whispered, pressing a small roll of cash into Grace's hand. "That woman Brenda, she has a serpent's tongue. Be careful." Grace could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. Her mind wasn't on the injustice or the lost fortune. It was on Jay. She could hear his distressed cries echoing faintly from the living room, a sound that tore at her soul. She was being ripped away from him, branded a thief, and there was nothing she could do. As Richard came to escort her to the service elevator, she paused at the entrance to the living room. Albert was standing with his back to her, staring out at the city lights. Brenda was attempting to soothe Jay, her touch awkward and clinical. "Hush now, Jay. The nasty woman is leaving. Auntie Brenda is here." Jay thrashed against her touch, his cries growing more frantic. He was typing a single word over and over on his screen, hitting the key with jerky, desperate movements. "Grace, Grace, Grace!" Grace's heart broke. She locked eyes with Albert's reflection in the glass. For a fleeting moment, she saw not anger, but profound gut-wrenching conflict. Then he hardened his expression, and the mask of the cold billionaire was back in place. Richard gently guided her away, and the doors of the service elevator closed, shutting her out of the gilded cage for good. Back in the penthouse, the aftermath was a desolate silence, punctuated by Jay's lingering sobs. "Well, that's that," Brenda said with an air of finality. "Good riddance. Now we can get back to normal and hire a proper, vetted professional." Albert didn't answer. He walked over to his son. Jay refused to look at him, his face buried in his shoulder, his small body trembling. The word grace still glowed on his screen. Something was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. Albert's business success was built on one thing above all else: reading people. He'd seen greed, deceit, and desperation in his boardrooms. Grace's devastation had felt authentic. Her shock at seeing the necklace had been too raw to be faked. And Jay, a child his age, couldn't fake that kind of attachment, that level of grief. He looked at the necklace in his hand. Then he looked at Richard, who had returned and was standing silently by the door, his expression unreadable, but troubled. "Richard," Albert said, his voice low. "When you searched her room, where exactly was the necklace?" "In the side pocket of her old backpack, sir. The one she arrived with." "Did it look like she used that bag often?" Richard paused. "No, sir. It was at the back of the closet, covered in a thin layer of dust. It looked like it hadn't been touched since she moved in." The detail was small, but it was a crack in the foundation of his certainty. Why would a thief hide a priceless necklace in a dusty, forgotten bag? Why not somewhere more clever? Or why not get it out of the building immediately? "And the safe," Albert continued, his mind working furiously. "What is the protocol for the study?" "Cleaned daily by the regular staff, sir. But Maria is the only one who dusts near your desk. The security protocol is clear. No one enters your study without your explicit permission." "No one," Albert pressed. "No one, sir," Richard confirmed. "Except for you. And family." The word hung in the air. Albert looked at Brenda, who was now scrolling through her phone, looking bored now that the drama was over. "Brenda," he said suddenly, "you said you went into the study to look for a photo of Eleanor. Which one?" Brenda looked up, startled. "Oh, just a silly one of us on holiday in Greece. I thought it might cheer Jay up." And the safe was ajar. "You're certain?" "Yes, of course," she said, a hint of impatience in her tone. "I told you." Albert walked into his study, Richard following. He went to his desk, where a digital photo frame cycled through hundreds of pictures of Eleanor. "The photos are all digitized, Brenda. We haven't had physical photo albums out in years. You know that." He turned to face her, his eyes like chips of ice. "You lied. Why did you go into my study?" Brenda's composure finally cracked. A flicker of panic crossed her face. I must have forgotten they were digitized. I was just worried about the safe." "How convenient," Albert said, his voice soft and dangerous. He turned to his head of security. "Richard, I want the security footage from the hallway outside this study for the past 48 hours. Every second." "Albert, that's ridiculous," Brenda protested. "You're not going to interrogate me, your own family." "The system only records over itself every 48 hours, Richard said quietly. "If we're going to get it, we need to do it now." A half-hour later, the three of them were in the security monitoring room. Richard expertly queued up the footage. They watched hours of emptiness of Maria dusting quickly and leaving. Then at 2:17 a.m. the previous night, a figure appeared. It was Brenda. She looked both ways down the empty hall before using a key card to enter the study. She was inside for nearly 10 minutes. The footage had no audio, but her actions were clear. When she exited, She glanced around nervously before hurrying away. "You have a keycard to my study?" Albert asked, his voice deathly quiet. "Eleanor gave it to me years ago for emergencies." Brenda stammered, her face pale. "I was just checking on things." "At 2 a.m. Albert's voice rose. "After lying about why you were in there, Richard, is there a camera in Grace's hallway?" There was. They switched feeds. At 3:05 a.m., they saw Brenda again, slipping down the quiet residential hall. She paused outside Grace's suite, using another key card, a master housekeeping card, to let herself in. She was inside for less than a minute. When she came out, her hands were empty. She had planted the necklace. The truth hit Albert with the force of a physical blow. The deception, the sheer calculated malice of it. It wasn't a grifter he'd let into his home. It was his own family. His wife's sister. "Why?" he whispered, turning to Brenda, who was now backed into a corner, her face a mask of terror. "Why would you do this?" Brenda's carefully constructed facade crumbled into ugly, resentful tears. "Because of him," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at the monitor showing Jay's room. "Because of everything you've poured into him. Eleanor is gone, and all you care about is that broken boy, the Langdon fortune, the legacy. It should be managed by family, by me. I was supposed to be the one to guide you to help raise him properly." Then she came along. The little saint from the gutter. You started looking at her, listening to her. You were giving her the influence that was rightfully mine. I had to get rid of her. I had to show you what she really was. The confession, raw and venomous, filled the room. Albert felt nothing but a cold, empty disgust. He had been blind. His grief and cynicism had made him the perfect target for her poison. He had trusted the serpent and cast out the one person who had shown genuine kindness to his son. He looked at Richard. "Find her. Sir, find Grace. Now. Use every resource we have. I don't care what it takes. Bring her back." He then turned to Brenda, his expression so cold and furious, she physically flinched. "Get out," he said. "Get out of my building and get out of my life. The lawyers will be in touch. Eleanor may have been your sister, but you are no longer family to me or my son. If you ever come near us again, I will use this footage to ruin you." Finding Grace wasn't easy. She hadn't gone back to her apartment. She hadn't used her bank cards. She had simply vanished, swallowed up by the city she had tried so hard to escape. For 2 agonizing days, Albert lived in a hell of his own making. Jay refused to eat, refused to interact. He just sat in his chair, listless and silent, the light gone from his eyes. Albert sat with him, talking to him, apologizing to both his son and the empty room. But the silence was his penance. Finally, Richard got a hit. Using traffic camera footage, he tracked the taxi Grace had taken from a bus station. It had dropped her off outside the Bright Horizon Senior Care Facility in Elmwood Park. Albert drove there himself, the Rolls-Royce, a grotesque symbol of his failure in the humble parking lot. He found Grace sitting by the bedside of an elderly woman with vacant eyes. Grace was holding her hand, humming the same tuneless, soothing melody she had hummed for Jay. She looked up as he entered, and her eyes, red-rimmed and exhausted, showed no surprise, only a deep, bone-weary sadness. "Miss O'Malley," Albert began, his voice cracking. "Grace, you shouldn't be here, Mr. Langdon," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off her mother. "I know what happened," he said, taking a step closer. "I know it was Brenda. She framed you. I have proof. She's gone, Grace. I threw her out." Grace finally looked at him. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "And that's supposed to fix it." "You didn't believe me. You looked at me, and you saw a thief." "I was wrong," he said, the words costing him more than any billion-dollar deal. "I was a fool. My wealth, my past. It's taught me to suspect everyone. I let her poison my mind because it was easier to believe in deceit than in genuine goodness. I am so sorry." He stopped, his throat closing up. "I'm not here to ask you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. I'm here to beg you. Jay. He needs you. He's fading, Grace. I can give him the best medicine in the world, but you're the only one who can give him a reason to get better. Please, come home." The word hung in the air between them. Home. Grace looked from the powerful, broken man in front of her to her mother, lost in the fog of her own mind. She had spent her life caring for others, only to be betrayed and discarded. But then she thought of Jay. She thought of his laugh, of his cleverness, of his small hand reaching for hers. He was innocent in all of this. She let out a long, shuddering breath. "My mother," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't leave her here. Not like this." "She won't be here," Albert said instantly. "I've already made arrangements. The finest private facility in the state. A suite 24-hour specialized neurological care, music therapy, anything she could possibly need. It's done. All of your debts paid. Your nursing school tuition covered if and when you ever want to return. This isn't a job offer, Grace. This is an apology. This is me trying to fix the mess I made." He was offering her a golden key to a life she could never have imagined. But looking at his face, she saw it wasn't a transaction. It was a plea. He wasn't a billionaire trying to buy a solution. He was a father, desperate to save his son. Slowly, Grace stood up. She leaned down and kissed her mother's forehead. "I'll be back soon, Mom," she whispered. She turned to Albert. "Let's go see our boy." The drive back was quiet. When they walked into the penthouse, Jay was in the living room with Maria, looking small and lost in the vast space. His head was down. "Jay," Grace said softly. His head snapped up. His eyes widened. A sound escaped his lips, a cry of pure, unadulterated joy. He began to rock in his chair, his hands flapping with excitement. He fumbled for his computer, typing with a speed and dexterity no one had ever seen from him. 2 words glowed on the screen. Grace. Home. Grace rushed to him, kneeling down and pulling him into a hug. Jay wrapped his arms around her neck, holding on with a strength that surprised her, and buried his face in her shoulder, just as he had in the diner. Albert watched them, his eyes blurring with tears. This was what wealth was for. Not for power, not for prestige, but for this. For the chance to right a terrible wrong. For the chance to bring a family, a strange and broken one, back together. Grace's life had been changed forever, but in truth, so had his. She hadn't just saved his son. She had saved him from the prison of his own making. The real fortune, he now understood, was not in his bank account, but in the sound of his son's happy cries and the presence of the waitress who had shown him the meaning of true value. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a billionaire and a waitress. It was a story about seeing beyond labels, the rich man, the poor girl, the disabled boy, and recognizing the shared human heart that beats within us all. Albert Langdon learned that his greatest asset wasn't his fortune, but his capacity to trust and to love. And Grace O'Malley discovered that her greatest strength wasn't her resilience in the face of hardship, but the boundless power of her own compassion. She didn't just stay as Jay's companion. With Albert's full backing, she finished her nursing degree and went on to become a leading pediatric therapist, revolutionizing care for non-verbal children. Together they established the Eleanor and Jay Langdon Foundation for Compassionate Care, ensuring that thousands of other children would benefit from the simple, profound lesson she taught, that sometimes the most powerful therapy is a loving human touch. Their story reminds us that kindness is a currency that never loses its value. It can bridge any divide, heal any wound, and in the most unexpected moments, a single act of empathy can change a life, or in this case, 3 forever. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that inspire and uplift. What was your favorite moment in Grace and Albert's journey? Let us know in the comments below.